Welcome to Real World, Real Talk with Dr. D.Z. Cofield. The show represents captivating conversations and insightful information to encourage and inspire you with all you need to become the best you can possibly be. And now, your host for Real World, Real Talk, Dr. D.Z. Cofield.
Welcome to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. D.Z. Cofield, Senior Pastor at the Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church, and I'm privileged to welcome you to your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for jazz and more, KTSU 90.9 on the FM dial and KTSUradio.com. I want to thank all of you who have been supporting this station, not just during this campaign, but down through the years. You have been with KTSU. We're 50 years old and never looked better in our lifetime. And we're grateful and thankful to our leadership, our general manager, Ernest Walker, our program manager, and all of our staff. And of course, all of those who are on the hill, on the other side of the yard, who make this station what it is. Our president, our vice presidents, everybody who supports and loves this station. We want to thank you for your continued support of the choice 90.9 KTSU. Now, we are in the midst of an intense election season. If you haven't heard already, there are major races being run, including for governor of the state of Texas. No presidential election this time, but the midterm elections always set the course for where our country is going to go. Presidents have typically lost the midterm election in terms of the number of seats they have in office, whether it's the House or it's the Senate. And that creates struggles and issues moving forward. But this election, this time, man, promises to be a very fervent fight for seats, for offices, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. It really doesn't matter. We're just talking about getting out and making your voice heard by casting your vote. And this season is a season that needs to hear your voice. People complain all the time that their voice doesn't matter, that their voice doesn't count. Man, listen, we're going to talk today about empowering voters, defending democracy. That's what the League of Women Voters is challenging all of us to do. And when you hear the numbers, the people who are not voting, not just those who are voting, but the hundreds of thousands of people who are not voting, who are not making their voices heard, man, listen, it's hard to complain about how you're treated when you don't speak up for yourself and make sure that your issues are at the forefront of our elected officials' minds. Just a couple of housekeeping matters before we get started. First of all, if you'd like to follow me during the week, you can follow me on IG at DZ Cofield. You can follow me on Facebook at DZ Cofield, and you can follow me on Twitter at, you guessed it, DZ Cofield. Man, I am so happy to have back with us today Dr. Annie Johnson Benefield. She is the president of the League of Women Voters of Houston. She's a retired professor and chair of social science at Lone Star College in Tomball, where she served for 30 years teaching political science courses and developing and structuring programs for civic education and involvement of students in the broader community. Her work with the League of Women Voters includes working on voter registration projects. She has been with this organization now for many years, and we're excited that she is with us. She's the former president of the Texas Community College Teachers Association, the largest state advocacy group for community college teachers. She's a member of the Houston Metropolitan Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and she's a member of the Ushers Ministry at the Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church. I'm really excited to have Dr. Annie Johnson Benefield here with us on today. And I want you to join me in welcoming her to Real World, Real Talk. Dr. Annie Johnson Benefield, how are you doing, ma'am?
Well, I'm doing great, Dr. Cofield. I am doing great. Just busy, but great.
I'm about to say, this is your time of year. Whenever we talk about getting out the vote, we spoke earlier in the spring around the midterm elections to say things have gotten heated up as we are now approaching this November election. This main election time is an understatement. Tell me what you are seeing and sensing within our community as we're seeing hotly contested races developing in Texas, for example, from the governor all the way down, various local elections as well as state-run elections. What do you see happening, and even on the federal level?
What I think is happening from looking at the numbers and looking at the data, turnout will determine everything in terms of who's going to win and who's going to lose in this political contest. Usually in the past, high voter turnout has represented advantages for Democratic candidates. However, in some more recent times, that has not always been the case. The election, getting your people, getting the individuals associated with your party, or getting individuals who's interested in the agenda items that you're setting forth is critical to whether or not you're going to win or lose. So here, the polling data, it has been taken for granted that Texas was, for the most part, a red state, but increasingly the numbers are reflecting there are changes in demographics that are taking place across the state, that communities of color represent the majority of the population combined in terms of Hispanics and African American has surpassed the Anglos in terms of sheer numbers. So those are factors that one has to contend with. Who gets out their constituency in terms of the election between now and early voting, which starts Monday, October 24th, and ends on November 4th and on November 8th. Last year, in 2020, 2 years ago, when they had the election, the presidential contest, more people turned out doing early voting. In Harris County, in particular, only about 300,000 people turned out on the actual election day. Most of that 1.6 million people in Harris County who turned out to vote had turned out doing early voting. And so on election day, which there was 2.4 million people registered in Harris County, whereas only 1.6 million people actually turned out to vote. So that left 800,000 people who were registered to vote did not turn out to vote. So that is why we focus a lot on voter registration. In Harris County, there are over 2.5 million people who are registered to vote, but the impetus to get turnout. And so that is one of the reasons that the League of Women Voters sponsored a rally to actually facilitate empowering the voters by providing them with voter information and getting them excited about turning out to vote, doing early voting.
So let's talk about that rally, empowering voters, defending democracy. And I want to read the list of people who have joined with you in this rally and who are supporting the work of the League of Women Voters. You had Texas Children's Hospital, one of your primary sponsors, Black Women of Greater Houston PAC, City of Houston, Greater Houston Black Chamber, Houston Area Urban League, Houston Metropolitan Baptist Ministers Conference, Metro, NAACP Houston Branch, Texas Southern University Student Government Association, Top Ladies of Distinction, University of Houston Student Government Association, a plethora of churches, including Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church Social Justice Ministry. I know the Good Hope Church Social Justice Ministry is supporting this as well. Why is this important? As a matter of fact, I'm going to ask you to respond to a statement that you made. You're quoted as saying, democracy is not a spectator sport where one simply sits in the arena and watches events take place, but rather a gladiator sport where you fight for what you believe in, such as voting rights, equality, and justice. And let me also name another major sponsor and partner with you is the Defender Network. Talk about that quote, because I don't know if people have really thought about voting and participation in the democratic process as not just a sporting event, but a gladiator sport. I mean, where it's literally combat. But I don't think you're off in that analogy. Talk about why you use those words.
I have been involved in terms of the voter registration process for quite some time. I've been with the League of Women Voters volunteering in various capacities since 1999, when I first did my naturalization ceremony, where over 2,000 citizens were sworn in. But just registering people does not translate into them becoming engaged and participating in the political process. So the impetus is to get people to understand that there's a direct correlation in terms of what public policy, what happens, the people who vote, the allocation of resources happen as a direct result of the level of engagement. Elderly people tend to vote and participate in the political process. And as a direct result of that, our budget at the federal level is geared more toward programs that affect those seniors. The same thing at the city and county level and the state level. The people who are more engaged in the political process tend to get more resources allocated in their community. And as a political scientist from teaching 30 years plus years, I understood that dynamic. And so it appears that we're not communicating effectively enough with communities of color, in particular, that your vote counts and the resources your community receive are directly correlated to how you engage in this particular process. And so I was sitting there thinking about democracy. In order for a democracy to be effective, to fulfill the desire that is the rule of the many have to be engaged, not an aristocracy with the rule of the few. And seeing it as a gladiator sport in the arena, I was told by someone recently that they said that I would be perceived as an angry Black woman if I said gladiator. And I said, no, but politics is a gladiator sport. There are winners and there are losers. Yeah. The reality is that there are winners and losers. In the political process, there are winners and losers. We never remember the person who lost the election, not normally. The exception probably is in 2020 that people have spent a lot more time talking about the loser, the person who lost the election, than the person who won the election. Right. But normally you forget about who ran. The winner is the winner and you just go on. And so communities of color, in January 1st of this year, 2022, I became the first African-American woman to be president of the League of Women Voters of Houston in its 102 years of existence. And so one of the things that I stated as a policy goal was to reach out to communities of color to make them understand that the League of Women Voters is an organization that has been advocating for 102 years for voting rights and for other public policies as well, but to reach out to other groups who have not been involved in the League of Women Voters and to partner with them. And the rally is an illustration, an example of what coalition building can do, that you can build across communities. And the impetus for that is to ensure that people are going to engage, that communities of color are going to be represented in the political discourse, and that they're going to be informed. And part of that is that we've been very strategic in terms of providing voter information, in terms of our voters guide, FYI pamphlets about the election process. We've distributed across sororities and fraternities all across the city of Houston and Harris County, making it available so people will have fact-based, nonpartisan information. The League's objective is not to tell you who to vote for, but to make sure that you engage and let your voice be heard in this political process.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. DZ Cofield, and we're talking about engaging in your democracy. We're talking about fighting for and exercising your right to vote. If you'd like more information on the League of Women Voters, you can go to LWV, Houston.org, LWVHouston.org. You can also find their voters guide there that can lay out for you the various candidates. And
I know I can't see this.
if you're watching online, Dr. Benefield is holding up this full color print that election guide is typically in black and white, but it got a little color this time. And we're certainly thankful for the progress that the League of Women Voters is making. Let's talk about the difference that voting makes in elections in terms of the percentages of people that currently vote and the number of people who are not voting, and how it would change an election if people actually got out there and vote. And I'm talking about people of color. I'm talking about people who may not be considered people of color. I'm talking about white, Asian, African American, Latino, or Latinx. It doesn't matter. Let's just talk about the number of people who are registered to vote and why their activity in the voting process is so important. What kind of numbers of people typically vote?
Well, back in 2020, Texas had 17 million people who were registered to vote. The overall population of the state of Texas is about 30 million people right now. But of course, all of those people are not voting age. It has a huge young population that's under 18. But in terms of actual turnout, people are not turning out at the rate in which they are registered to vote. That lots of registered voters, for example, in Harris County, there was 2.6 million people, 2.4 million people who were registered to vote in 2020, but only 1.6 million of those people actually turned out. That was 800,000 people who didn't show up, who didn't engage, who didn't participate at all in the electoral contest. And that happens in statewide elections. People who are less educated, people of color, are the people who are least likely to turn out and vote in elections. And many of the social scientists argue it's because people feel disaffected, they feel apathetic toward the political system. The political system is not responding specifically to them, but in part, politicians and political leaders often respond to the people who vote. And so if you're not engaged, if you're not voting, if you're not expressing what you desire to happen in your community, then you're, for the most part, as a political leader, you're trying to get out the people who are going to support you. You don't want the people who are not going to support you to come out to the polls to vote and participate and engage.
So how many, what percentage of people, I mean, I've heard numbers as low as 12% of registered voters, 7% of registered voters. What are we talking about when we talk about the percentage of registered voters actually coming out to vote?
Well, even though there were 17 million people who were registered, I think 17 million people registered back in 2020. The actual numbers, I think less than 13 million people actually turned out and voted statewide in the state of Texas. So people are not engaging based on the numbers, and particularly in communities of color, the turnout is not equivalent to
that's what I was going to ask you.
Population that they represent.
That's what I was going to ask you. So if that's the number in general, as those numbers are broken down across ethnic lines, percentage wise, it seems like African Americans are near the bottom in terms of number of registered voters versus the number of people who are actually voting.
Well, in the past, actually, African Americans' turnout rate, depending on what election it is, has been comparable with Anglos. The Hispanics have had the lowest turnout rate of the different racial and ethnic group. Asians tend to have a higher turnout rate. They tend to be more educated than the general population in terms of numbers. Highly educated people are more likely to turn out. Low educated people are least likely to turn out. People with less than a high school education or high school and below, they have a lower turnout number. Old people, they tend to turn out in greater numbers. The 65 plus crowd tend to turn out at about 65 or 70%. They have more vested. And then one person told me, he said, well, young people don't have time to turn out and vote because they have other things that are more important than voting. And my contention is, what's more important than voting? What's the alternative in terms of public policy? We allocate more resources based on who turn out and who vote and participate in the political process. If you want to effectuate change, As I frequently told my students, you have to make a deposit in order to make a withdrawal. If you're not willing to deposit, that means cast a ballot expressing a preference for a candidate, then you shouldn't expect a return on your invest. You haven't invested in anything, so there's no return on it. So the political system responds to people adding pressure, applying pressure, and voting is one way to effectuate change. There are a lot of other ways to contact. And, being on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, making your videos and talking about the issues as a young person that you're upset about. But if you're not casting a ballot, you're not effectuating any changes. People are laughing at your videos, enjoying what you're doing because you're basically entertaining. But as I said, democracy is not a spectator sport where you're going to be sitting on the sidelines watching other people effectuate the change or getting engaged in events. You are the person who should be effectuating the change that you want to see. So if you want equality, you want justice and voting rights in your community, you got to stand up and cast a ballot and vote for candidates who support those particular objectives. Sitting on the sidelines, well, I don't care who wins or who loses because it doesn't matter. It does matter. And especially for people of color, in light of our history and what people have gone through, I sit there and I think about my parents. They didn't get a chance to cast a ballot, to vote, until they were over 50 years old. They were over half a century. And that was directly in response to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And my mom cast a ballot in every electoral contest, presidential electoral contest, up until 2020. And she died in 2021. She was a 103-year-old person, but she had cast subsequently every election. And I know that she saw the impetus for the reason that people should vote and engage in the political process, because when she grew up, they didn't even have a high school for Blacks in her community. So the farthest education she could get was the 8th grade. She didn't have options and choices. But as people got an opportunity to vote and engage in the political process, things changed in her community. There's a commissioner of color on the county board. That has happened directly as a result of the Voting Rights Act and people voting and Black people getting engaged in the political process.
So I want to ask you this question because I want to make this as tangible for our listening audience as possible.
Okay.
We see elections where primaries, and we'll see it in the general election, where some elections will be decided by less than 1,000 votes.
Yeah.
Some decided by less than 2,000 votes, which, are not large numbers when you think about our aggregate number of organizations and groups and people. There are churches prior to COVID that had 2,000 people sitting in their pews on a Sunday that literally, if all of them were registered and all of them voted in a particular area, would have changed the outcome of a race. What kind of numbers are we talking about? Like, for example, if African American people, I know Latinos have typically been at the bottom of the scale, and that's why I said African Americans tend to be near at the bottom in terms of our actual voter participation based on the number of registered voters, because we've had a lot of work in registering voters. That's been going on for years.
Yes.
We have not flipped the switch to get a lot of those people who are registered active and getting them going out and voting in the same numbers that we've registered people. I'm curious if we go from 10% to 20%, like somebody that's listening right now who may be one of those spectators, and we have, a couple of 100,000 people listening right now, right? Okay. Like if 10% of that 200,000 people or so who are listening, if 20,000 people voted, I mean, they would literally make a major shift, a major change in what the voting results would be. I mean, am I accurate when I say that? Because it sounds like if there's not that many people voting, it's not going to take that many people to be heard or to make changes that they think need to be made if they get up and go and vote.
You're exactly right, Dr. Cofield. That is true. If people are sitting on the sideline and not engaging in the process, sometimes a candidate may win may actually end up winning an election or losing an election by a few percentage points because it was only a matter of a few thousand votes in a particular race that effectuated that outcome. And people could sit on the sidelines and say, my vote wouldn't have made a difference, so it wouldn't have mattered. But the reality is it would have made a difference if the 1960 presidential election, for example, I think is an excellent illustration. They say if there had been a one vote change in every precinct in Chicago, then Richard Nixon would have won the presidential contest. That is probably one of the most vivid illustration or examples that people talk about. One vote change in every precinct could have made the difference between whether John Kennedy became president or Richard Milhouse Nixon. Just one vote. And so most often than not, we don't think of this one vote making a difference. But in hotly contested, one of the things in many states is a simple majority rule, a plurality, whoever wins the most vote. In some of the states, in the South in particular, from the vestiges of segregation and slavery, you have to win 50 plus one in terms of a majority, 50 plus one. If no candidate cross that threshold, like for example, in the state of Georgia, they even have to have a runoff after the general election. Whereas in most other states, if you win the most votes in the general election, you automatically have won that office, but not in the state of Georgia. You have to win that 50 plus one in order to win that election. So if we can motivate and tell people and get people, particularly in communities of color, that the candidates who are running, which candidate best represents your interests? Which candidate is talking about the issues that matter in your particular community? And that means we have to educate ourselves and we have to pay attention. And that's why I say the voter's guide, you can sit there and compare candidates in terms of their response to the questions that they've been asked. Sometimes they didn't answer the question, though. So, quite a few of the candidates did not. Almost all of the statewide elected candidates who are on the ballot this time did not answer our survey question to respond to the electorate. I think voters should be able to choose the candidates, not the candidates choose the voters.
So let's talk about that because the League of Women Voters Guide is now available. lwvhouston.org. L as in Lucy, W as in Walter, V as in Victor, Houston.org is the website that you can go to, and you can find the voter's guide there. And it's touted as a nonpartisan, fact-based information guide for voters. It's in English, in Spanish, in Chinese, and in Vietnamese. It's available in all four of those languages. But talk about how is it fact-based and how is it nonpartisan? And I know the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization, but talk about the information that is transmitted. You talked just for a moment ago about survey questions and things. How do you gather facts so that this becomes a credible clearinghouse for people who are just looking for information, people who want to get away from public opinion news and actually get good public information, even if it is slightly jaded based on who is delivering it, but at least you're hearing directly from the people that are running for office. What makes this voter's guide so powerful?
The voter's guide is, we have a team of people who work. We're all volunteer organizations, so we have a team of people who work on developing questions that are neutral, that does not lean in any particular kind of way toward one political party, a candidate, or anything of that nature. We simply people read newspapers, they read magazine articles, they go to the candidate site, they are familiar with all the issues that are happening in the state, and they craft questions that are neutral in nature, and they post them to the candidate. The candidate responds in his or her own words. We don't change anything. If they misspell some words when they respond, if they say something that's untowardly, We allow it to be published exactly as they stated it. We don't add on, we don't change it, we don't variation. So when we say fact-based, these are the facts as the candidate presented them. We didn't change the wording. We didn't do anything to it. We make sure the questions are neutral in nature, meaning that they are not leaning toward in any direction toward a political party and a political candidate, because we want voters to trust the information they're getting from us, that we don't have, as one might say, a dog in this fight. We just want to make sure people engage in the democratic process. We're not telling you who to vote for. We're just presenting you with information so you can make an informed, intelligent decision. That is all that we're asking, that the voters do the research, to look at the research that we've already completed, use that as a basis for making a decision. So we are not trying to sway you in any particular direction or anything of that nature. We just want people to vote and engage in the political process. The link has been produced in the Voter's Guide from way back before the 1950s. It was a single sheet page, and then it evolved. Now this is a 72-page document that has all of this information in it. And we just don't include information about the candidates. We also try to include information that you need to know about elections and the political process, what kind of ID you would need when you go to the poll, and we try to facilitate. And on election day, we usually have an election day helpline. So if voters are out there trying to cast their ballot on election day and they call in, we can provide them with the information they need, like where's the closest polling place? Am I really registered to vote? That is a bit late to be asking that question on election day, but we provide the information to that. And we're trying to get out information in advance of the election so you can find out it's too late to register to vote for this election, but it's not too late to register so you can vote in future elections. This is just one election.
Got you. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Real World, Real Talk. We're going to take a break. We'll be back in just a moment. There's been a lot of talk about voting locations and how to find out where to vote. Can you vote anywhere, or are you restricted to a certain location? Just read an article about a precinct chair who is protesting because he doesn't have a school available to him. He doesn't have a church in his precinct. He wants to make a gun store one of his voting locations, and there's been opposition to that. We'll talk about all of that in just a moment. You're listening to The Choice 90.9 KTSU. We are your community station. And don't forget, if you want to join, become a part of the KTSU family, it's not too late. You can call 713-313-1909 and become a member, or text the word member, MEMBER, to 713-313-4354. We'll be back in just a moment.
Download our new I Am Hope mobile app in order to get or stay connected to our Good Hope family. To download the new app, you can visit our website at goodhope.org and click on the banner, or you can text Good Hope MBC app to 77977, or you can scan the QR code on the posters in the lobby or Center for Hope, or you can also search Good Hope MBC or I Am Hope in your Apple or Google Play Store. Let's continue to take hope to the world.
Welcome back to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. DZ Cofield, and we welcome you to our broadcast on today as we talk to Dr. Annie Johnson Benefield. She's the president of the League of Women Voters in Houston, and it is time to get out to vote. Early voting starts on tomorrow, October the 24th. The overwhelming majority of people, I hope you're trying to get out and vote early and make your vote count. Don't wait until election day, man. You don't know what's going to happen November the 4th. It can be an ice storm. It can be a blizzard. It can be a rain, a flood. Anything can happen. Emergencies in your family that can keep you from voting. Make sure you get out early and vote. Dr. Johnson Benefield, let's talk a little bit about voting. There are people who are concerned about where they can vote. I just talked to somebody who said to me, you know what, man, they closed down my voting location. The place that I normally voted, you can't vote there anymore. And I've heard some problems occurred at some voting locations. They didn't have enough electricity. They had, those kinds of problems. And so they could not use those as polling locations. But the beauty is, if I'm not mistaken, we can vote anywhere. Is that right?
In Harris County and Fort Bend County, you can vote at any polling location. You do not have to go to the one that's at your precinct. I know in Harris County, they're anticipating having over 700 and some polling places available. During early voting, I think it's supposed to be 90 some polling places available. So you don't have to. And harrisvote.com is the best website. I mean, they have an interactive website. You can pull up the map and you can put in an address based on where you are. If you're at work, if you're at home, you're going to the doctor's office and you want to stop by and vote, you can put that in and it will tell you where the polling locations is closest to where the destination that you're going. And if they have the red light, green light, yellow light system like traffic lights, if it's a red light, that means there's a wait time. If there's a yellow caution light, there's a few people in line. And if it's a green light, that means you can walk in, cast your ballot, and go. And in addition to that, if the red light comes up near the polling place from where you're located that you want to go to, then if you click on it, it will actually show you the next 3 closest polling places that are in that vicinity. And in order for you to be able to go and cast a ballot at a polling location, all polling locations have to be ADA compliant. So that means that they have to be inspected and meet certain kinds of requirements in terms of in and out, that people have access, that the doors have to be wide enough in terms of ADA compliance, and that they have to have air conditioning or heat or whatever it is that's required at that particular point when the election is taking place, and accessible to the general population. So maybe in the quest that this Harris County election administrators contract with particular places, you have to be willing to offer your facility, and they have to make sure it's ADA compliant before they can have it as a polling location. So maybe the place changed where this person always voted because a number of things. It's no longer accessible. The owner may not want his or her building to be used as a polling location anymore. So they actually asked, Harris County election administrators asked early in the year, and actually asked as recently as the summer, can you name some places, give us a list. They had a Google form you fill out to actually request a location be named. Then they had to check it out to make sure it was in compliance with ADA or whatever other compliances that needed to be before that could be determined. So compare it to, and I don't ever refer to the good old days, although people frequently like to use that form. Voting is much easier and more accessible than it's ever been in terms of where you could go. Because people used to have to go to the county courthouse to register. They used to have to go to the county courthouse to cast a ballot. Now there are polling locations in every community. So it's much more accessible to. There are churches, schools, libraries, businesses who allow their building facility to be used to be a polling location. So it's available.
Yeah, and I think, the beauty is they have carried over the practice in the primaries over into the general election, because for years you could vote anywhere for the primary election, but you had to vote in a specific precinct at a specific polling place in the general election, and then they just opened it up and said, hey, you can vote anywhere, which makes sense, because if I can vote in the primary anywhere, I certainly should be able to vote in the general election anywhere.
Well, the thing that people don't understand, the primaries are controlled by the political parties, not by the election administrators. They contract with them, but they supply the workers to actually do that. So when people had some issues back in March, because they showed up at a polling location, assuming that was a place that they could vote if they were a Democrat, and it might have been a Republican polling location, or they went to a Republican polling location and they were a Democrat, and it wasn't no Democratic clerks or anything, because the machines were programmed in a particular way, and so you just couldn't vote at any machine. Whereas for the general election, that's not the case. And when the county, if the two parties have not agreed to come together and say, we're going to have a joint primary election, and so they can program the machine so it wouldn't matter which party you identify with, you could go to that machine and actually cast a ballot. So that's the difference between the primary elections and the general election. And so having more places readily available and accessible to the people should simplify the process. But sometimes that also meant that the place down the street that you always went to for 50 years is no longer the place that you can go to now to vote.
Tell us why the rally on Saturday, why was that rally so important? I heard some people talk about the significance of it being at Emancipation Park celebrating its 150th birthday. Actually, Emancipation Park was purchased the same year that our church was founded. So we're both in the midst of our sesquicentennial celebration. But talk about the significance of having it at Emancipation Park and the number of community partners that came together to make the event successful.
I thought it would be very important to have it on land where former enslaved individuals had the impetus to acquire and purchase land. Emancipation suggesting freedom, that and voting to me is interlinked to the idea of freedom, that
Wow.
you can't separate it, you can't partition it out, you can't parcel it out. And so having it at that location was the only place that I said we have to do it at Emancipation Park. And luckily and fortunately, it was available to actually do it there. And reaching out to partners, I have to admit, the Sonny Messiah Giles is a force to be reckoned with the Defenders Network, Houston Defenders Network, that she had wanted to do something major. And I wanted to do something major, and just so happened fortuitously, if you believe in the divine power, that we were brought together and actually was able to work this together, that this came into being. And I was just like amazed. And it was like, this is where it should be. And she had partners who had worked with her previously. And then I said, I want this to be a remnants of the League of Women Voters. Since I've become president, I've tried to reach out to communities, particular communities of color, and show the welcoming atmosphere that the League is projecting in the community, that we are inclusive. We believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that we want all groups to be part of this community effort. So it just so happened that people were wanting to do something, and they were so glad that somebody had an idea. And when I reached out to the mayor's office, they were like, okay, they set up a meeting, we met, and they were saying, okay, this is what needs to happen. And they quite literally, I would say, I'm very thankful to them. They held my hand in the application process and facilitated me being able to move the process a lot forward quicker, because it usually takes 3 to 6 months to get an event on the agenda. And Emancipation Park, I learned some unique thing. Emancipation Park is controlled by two separate entities. The outside is controlled by the city, Parks and Recreation. The inside is controlled by a conservator. And so you can't take for granted that because you got permission from the park people on the outside that you can use it, that you can also have access to the inside. And so having access to the inside was critical, because the idea of rain or bad weather forecast, so having those two parts those two parts to come together. Yesterday we got the day before, like Wednesday, we got approval from the conservatory that we could actually have the event there. That was the impetus. That was like, okay, we're good to go. But we had already reached out to the partners in the Wheeler Avenue and Justice. And then I reached out to Deacon Cohen over at our church. And he and I had talked about some other things in earlier when they had the caravan event. And I was out of town, so I missed it. But I was like, this is a way that we can work together. This is the means by which that it should be a collaborative communal effort that churches and other historical organizations in the community should be able to come together. And I'd already been working with this guy in Dallas. He is Casey. He's the NAACP political action person. And so I've been working with him, trying to pull together a coalition of the Divine Nine, the 100 Black men, 100 Black women, and people like that. And so we already had some connectivity with other groups in the community to do this. And it just worked out. And we do have some very strong partners. We're going to pass out voters' guides. We're going to pass out pamphlets, why you should vote. And this is one of the major, I think probably the voters' guide will be more widely distributed in the community this election season than it's ever been previously, because everyone who comes to everyone at the rally had copies. We had over 1,000 copies to actually in handing them out.
Yeah. So let's talk about two phrases, and I want to get your commentary on them. One is the right to vote, and one is the privilege to vote. And sometimes I don't know if we use those terms synonymously, or we really don't understand the importance of both. You know, that the right to vote has been fought for, but it's also a privilege to be able to be part of a democracy. And having traveled extensively around the world and having been in other countries, you know, that right and that privilege people may feel privileged, but there are a lot of places where that right and privilege don't exist. Can you talk about that just for some of our listeners who may be saying, you know what, this is not a presidential election. I don't really need to vote, even though we are voting on a governor, you know, which is very, very important. You know, I don't know. You know, I don't know. I don't know if my vote is going to really matter. And I'm thinking back to an election not too long ago that was decided by like less than 10 votes. I mean, literally, a person in the state legislature lost the election by less than 10 votes. And, you know, I was just thinking, man, you know, that 11 people could have made the difference, right? And decided who went to Austin to represent that community. Talk about the right to vote and talk about the privilege to vote.
See, the right to vote has been fought for in communities of color in particular, more so. Actually, in terms of women, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, John Adams, when they were writing the Constitution and said, remember the lady. There was nothing in the United States Constitution that actually guaranteed citizens the right to vote and participate in the political process. In all of the 13 state colonies, as they were called, that became states, 12 of them had a requirement that you had to own property in order to vote. So if you didn't own property, you weren't considered a full citizen. Therefore, you could not participate in the political process at all. And the privilege, the idea that now that you're privileged, that you have the ability, I still have questions or issues with the idea that you consider voting a privilege, because it's almost like somebody gave you something for you to do, as opposed to that it was something that was fought for by generations of people who put their life on the line. Some people died in the process of the acquisition. Like the League of Women Voters came out of the suffragette movement. For 72 years, women struggled trying to get the right to vote. And although you historically see predominantly white women's face when you talk about that, Black women and Asian women and Hispanic women and and Native American women were involved in that struggle. I was listening to this historical presentation about a Native American tribe, and they said the women had more power, and they said they didn't want to give up their nationhood to become part of the United States because women were going to be subservient if they gave up the nation, their sovereignty to become part of the United States wholeheartedly, because women didn't have rights in American society at that time. And so these things have been fought for. So I can't see them as privileged if you're thinking that you had to fight for something. Now that you have that right, to exercise that right, to be engaged, to cast a ballot, to have a say in how your government works. A democracy is not a democracy if people are not engaging, are not casting a ballot and determining who their political leaders are, what the public policies that are affecting their community, and how the allocation of resources are being spent. And I know people always get excited about the presidential election. They say they consider the presidential election the sexy election, that more people do turn out for that. But in the state of Texas, education, funding for education, more than 90% of the funding for education happens not just at the state level, but at the local level. So how do you allocate those resources? The government that's closest to you tend to be your local government, not the presidential contest at the national level, but rather the community in which you live in right here, right now, that those leaders, the attorney general, the secretary, the secretary of state is not an elected office, but the comptroller has to decide whether or not they certify the budget after the state legislature passed the budget, that there's enough resources to do what it says it's going to do. The governor, the lieutenant governor, sets the agenda for the state legislative session and help decide what issues are going to be considered. That means what policies will be made ultimately come into focus as a direct result of this person participating in the political process. So your choice in terms of casting a ballot to choose these leaders will determine what happens in your community for the next 4 years. The term of office is 4 years for the statewide elected officials, 2 years for your U.S. congressional representative, 4 years for the county commissioners and the county judges in that way, and for the other federal and for the other statewide judges who are on the ballot. So what happens in outcome if you have a brush with the law in terms of the criminal justice system? What happens when there's a civil case? Between civil cases, half of the judges are civil judges, the other half are criminal justice judges. So do you want to have a say in how your community is affected by the decisions that are rendered in terms of sentencing, in terms of property decisions in civil cases and the outcome? That all of these things are on the ballot, and you get to determine who are the individuals that's going to represent you in your community on that battle. So I actually think that statewide and local elections are premier, the most important where citizens should be engaging. And when you talk about the local school board election, that very rarely people turn out at a significant level. Well, they decide who's the superintendent, what kind of policies are going to be implemented in your school district, what kind of material is going to be read. So you need to be engaged at every level of government so your community can be represented, so your voice can be heard. And if you opt out of the system, the famous comedian George Carlin said, if you don't vote, don't squawk. You don't have a right to say anything wrong with the system if you didn't participate in the system. But then he had some less than kind things to say in another way, but that's a whole different story.
Yeah. Well, I think though what you're pointing out is so important. I'm learning firsthand as I'm getting older the importance of these non-sexy races and the power that they have. When we think about, for example, our state school board elections, you don't see a lot of people running for state school board. There's a lot of advertising. There's not a lot of marketing. You probably would not even know somebody was running unless somebody was running from your area to be elected. But when you think about, these are people who are deciding bans on books in schools. These are people who are deciding what curriculum is going to be
Absolutely.
used in the state of Texas. And, I don't care how proud people are about being from Texas and, don't mess with Texas and all of these cute cliches. When you look at the fact that Texas is in the bottom 10% in every area educationally, primary, middle, high school, it's a travesty. It's a shame. And we just send people up there, many of whom are on the State Board of Education who have never been educators. I can't even tell you, standing in front of them, making a pitch and a proposal for a charter school, for example, and they have no knowledge of it, never worked in education, but they're the ones that are making those decisions. We have justices who are sitting on courts now because they are great politicians, but are not good lawyers. And when you don't care, these are the courts that you stand in, and you're looking for justice, and you're not going to get it because more than these people not looking like you, not talking like you, and not understanding you, these are people who are not accountable to you. And at the end of the day, if I don't feel accountable to you, or I feel accountable to somebody else, there are two things that move people in the electoral process, and that's money and votes. And if you don't have a lot of money, you definitely should be voting, because everybody has the right to vote.
Mhm.
Dr. Annie Johnson Benefield, I want to close on this thought. We talked earlier, and you described voting as not a spectator sport. The political process is not a spectator sport, that you have to get involved. You use the term gladiator. You got to be willing to get in there and fight. And what some may consider anger, I hear as a passion from you to move and motivate people to vote. And so I want you to close out our show today, just imploring people and telling people why they need to get out there and vote, why they shouldn't sit on the couch, why they shouldn't sit at the table and complain, but why they need to get out starting on Monday. Tomorrow, early voting starts. Why they need to get out and vote.
Democracy is whatever you make it as an institutional structure. If you want representation, you have to vote. You have to have a say in the political process. A government gets its legitimacy from citizens participating in the political process. So I know that you can make the difference, or you can effectuate the change that you want to see in our society by getting out and casting a ballot at early voting beginning tomorrow. That is so critical to what's going to happen if communities of color show up and turn out in massive numbers doing early voting. It can show the impetus that and your political leaders that you're vested in the system, that you're willing to put something in order to get something out, that you're not merely a spectator in the arena, but you're a participant in the arena, and you plan to continue to participate so you can effectuate the change that you want to see in terms of making sure voting rights are accessible to every citizen who lives in this country. You're going to make sure that justice is available and that it's not based on a premium, that you're going to make sure that equality is what the Constitution says it is, the equal protection of the law for all people, because you feel passionate enough about the electoral process. You feel passionate about democracy as a system of government. This is the only system I've ever lived in. I don't know, some of you may actually have come from other countries and witnessed a different system, but I think this is worth, as I say, a gladiator sport. Democracy is worth fighting for, and it is worth effectuating the change that you want to see. It is worth casting your ballot to ensure that the individuals that are who represent your interests, who are talking about the issues that you're concerned about, that those are the people that you want to be in office, and you hold them accountable, because guess what? Another election will come. So I implore everybody to get out and vote during early voting. You've got lots of time, make a plan, check out the voter's guide as the instrument for which you will find information. Circle it. You can take this into the polling location. You cannot take your electronic devices. You can take a voter's guide or ballot. Go to harrisvote.com or vote 411. Find out who's on your ballot, mark it, and take this with you to the polling location.
Dr. Annie Johnson Benefield of the League of Women Voters Houston, I want to thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so
Real
much,
World, Real Talk.
Reverend Cofield. I really appreciate it. Thank you for affording me this opportunity.
Yo, appreciate you. The late Vernon John said, if you see a good fight, get in it. I always add, if you don't see a good fight, start one. And listen, this voting season, this may be for some of you the only punch that you can throw. But here's what I want to say to you. Go to the League of Women Voters website, get the voting guide, and make sure you are punching the best punch you can. Make sure you get that guide, mark those candidates that you're going to vote for. Take that guide into the voting booth with you. Make sure you vote for who you want to represent you, and then walk out, proudly get your sticker that says, I voted. That's the only way this democracy is going to be the best that it can be. You and I have to participate and know that our vote makes a difference. This is Dr. DZ Cofield for Real World, Real Talk signing off. Don't forget, continue to join KTSU. Remember, membership is 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So just because a campaign may have ended, membership is still going on, and KTSU is still here. 50 years and going strong because of your love and your support. Thank you so much for being with us. Stay tuned for Truth with V. Michael McKay, David Goldstein, Asia, and their guests. Until next time, God bless is my prayer.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Real World, Real Talk. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified of new episodes every week. Follow us via social media using the @RWRTDZ username on all platforms: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To submit any comments, questions, sponsor opportunities, or future show suggestions, visit us online at rwrtdz.com or via email at info@rwrtdz.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you've been inspired to be the change you want to see in the world today. Until next time, be real, keep it real, and stay real.